Knock, knock, knock. Lieutenant. I looked up from the mournful red glow of the embers within the little stove that heated my tent and saw Lucille's scarlet head poked through the door flap. You don't have to call me that when it's just us, Lucille. Come on in. I'm not really doing much anyway. In truth, I'd been doing my best to keep busy in the hours since the trial. I'd sat up with Jamie for a while afterward, only leaving once she promised to try and sleep in preparation for tomorrow. Chris hadn't said much, and I knew he already blamed himself for failing to get Jamie acquitted, despite the fact that we both knew who really was to blame. As the crowds dispersed, pacified enough that Sean no longer vexed over a potential revolt, Chris and I parted ways while I trudged back to the row of Green Army surplus tents assigned to my platoon. I'd checked on Lucille, got a supply report from Charlie, and retired to my personal tent, the one luxury afforded to an officer in the Rangers. Meant to be semi-permanent until better cabins could be built to house all the new wilderness refugees, my tent was spacious, about 10 foot by 10 foot square, with heavy green canvas walls, wooden support poles, and a plank floor. The workers had outdone themselves in turning the old army gear into improved shelters for our people, adding door frames and crude doors where the tent flaps would have been, installing miniature wood stoves in each fashioned from scrap metal, and they'd even knocked together a little pine desk for me from pallet wood. Still, it was nowhere near the lavish furnishings of the now decimated Elk Lodge at New Wilderness, as the rigid cot under my back reminded me with every toss and turn. Settling down beside me on the wooden footlocker that held my few belongings, Lucille wrapped both arms around her skinny frame and let out a weary sigh. I'm sorry about Captain Lanson. I shrugged, my eyes back on the glowing coals within the little metal stove, and poked a stick through the open fire door to stir them. What's done is done. She nodded, looked back down at her hands, and shifted on the footlocker lid. Permission to speak freely. She's really trying hard to fit the whole soldier persona. Too bad the uniform makes her look so small. Was I that awkward when I first showed up? At that, I let slide what could roughly pass as a smile and shook my head. You don't need to do all that, not for this. Oh, right. Lucille drew in a breath, and her fingers tugged at a frayed spot on her jacket cuff in idle thought. Can't we do something? I mean, we could smuggle her out with our trucks tomorrow, maybe drop her off in that old brick factory we found, and then. We can't interfere in the sentence. I swallowed hard, and tried not to look at Lucille, so she wouldn't see me blinking back my own frustration. Officers can't break the law, no matter who they are. If I help her, then I put myself and Chris at risk. Her face tightened into a confused frown. But you're special. No one else here is. No one else ever survived what you did. They have to listen to you. That's not how the world works. I laughed, a cold, cynical chuckle, and tossed another hickory stick into the fire. Just because I threw up splinters and lived doesn't mean I have the power to overturn our entire government. Folding her arms, Lucille scowled at the fire. Then why did Sean make you an officer? Lucille, I started, but she was already on a roll. It's so stupid. You have power, you have Major Decker on your side, there are 25 of us ready to do whatever you say, but you can't do anything because of some dumb law. She waved her arms dramatically, her face flushed a similar shade to her crimson locks. What good is being in charge if you can't do what you want? There I saw the truth in her downcast face, how she lowered her voice to a whisper as she examined her own fingers in distraction. This wasn't solely about Jamie, I knew it, this was about her sister, the only family Lucille had left in this twisted world. Andrea Campbell had taken up a rifle against the mutants in the early days of the outbreak and turned around at the last possible moment to distract Elsar guardsmen while Lucille, myself, and dozens of others from Black Oak slipped through a gap in the perimeter wall to freedom. We had no idea what became of her, but not a day went by that Lucille didn't worry. My family may as well be on Mars for how far away we are, but she has hope. Poor kid. If my mom or dad were somewhere in Black Oak, I'd drive myself crazy trying to find them. I faced her, and caught Lucille's gaze. Being a leader isn't about getting what you want, it's about sacrificing for the good of others. Andrea knew that, and Chris does too, otherwise he'd be the first one out there fighting to keep Jamie safe. Lucille's angry expression lightened somewhat at that, and she kicked at the canvas floor with her boot. But she's one of us. Andrea would say she's family. Why can't we make exceptions for that? Ethan's conversation with me in the motor pool returned to mind, and I picked up another chunk of wood to throw into the fire, watching the yellow flames dance to life. Humans aren't rational creatures, not when they're angry, afraid, or grieving. The only reason they ever acted logical in the first place is because powerful men like Sean, Chris, or Adam kept them from going insane. If Jamie wasn't found guilty, we'd be fighting an uprising, and she could have been shot, or even hanged by the mob. As crazy as it sounds, by sending her away, we're doing the best we can to save Jamie's life, along with hundreds more. Her shoulders fell, and Lucille hung her head. I guess so. It just doesn't seem fair. Politics rarely is. I sighed, my mental drain returning, and rubbed my face with one hand. It seemed this day had dragged on forever, and yet I knew I wouldn't sleep well if I lay down. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jamie's ashen face as the guards led her away, felt Vesitoric's knife in my ribs all over again, and imagined how awful it would be if he caught her. Boots thudded on the boardwalk outside, and a muffled voice called through my doorframe. Hannah. Chris. Throwing me a knowing look, Lucille rose to her feet and made a quick salute. I better go get some rest. You don't have to, I started to protest, but the girl cut me off with an ornery wink, and as the door opened, she slipped past Chris on the way out with another brief salute in his direction. Pulling the door shut behind him, Chris locked eyes with me, his face drawn and solemn. There's dinner, in my room. My stomach squirmed in vicious knots, and I shook my head. I'm not hungry. His lips twitched into a disappointed, if unsurprised half-smile. Not hungry, or not interested. Wake up, Hannah, he's flirting with you. Realizing my mistake, I pressed a palm to my forehead in humiliation. Sorry, it's just been a long day. Chris strode over to sit on the footlocker beside me, resting both elbows on his knees. Maybe you should stay then. Get some shut-eye. Tomorrow's going to be busy. I bit my lip at myself and climbed to my feet to grab my jacket. I didn't mean that as a no. And I didn't mean it as an order. He cocked his head to one side, studying me as I moved with a weary sigh. You went through the trouble to find some food. I jammed my boots on one by one in a clumsy hop. It's not like I'm going to sleep much anyway. Maybe not by yourself. Wait, what? I froze mid-hop, one boot on, and spun my head around to stare at him. Now, of all times, of all nights, was he finally inviting me into his bed now? Even if we had been in a place where I felt confident enough to get naked around him, there was no way I could summon enough will to feel sexy when Jamie faced exile. How on earth could he not see that? It doesn't have to be anything you don't want it to be. Reading my mind, Chris held up a hand to stop my frantic thoughts. Tomorrow is going to be tough on us both, and we're not going to get much time together once the offensive kicks off. I don't expect anything, Hannah, it's just, I don't want to be alone tonight. Please. At that last word, his voice tinged with emotion, and Chris's eyes begged me in a hurt, broken way I hadn't often seen. He didn't get overly emotional, even in the face of horrendous things, and for Chris to plead with me, it had to be bad. He was in pain, I could see it, and that was enough to rouse a sense of sympathy within me, a deep need to feel something other than agony from my own rash choices. Okay. I wrapped him in a quick hug, and then sped around the room to collect what I needed for the night. I'll just get some things, and we'll go. 2 seconds. We walked to the mechanical shed, and climbed to his office, where a fire waited in the grate, along with a pot of soup he bargained from the market. I'd already scrubbed myself down earlier at the communal bathhouse and changed into some lighter shorts behind a curtain in the corner of the room. It was warmer here, the building holding the heat of the fireplace better than my tent, and it smelled of chicken broth from the soup, a pleasant ambience that soothed my wounded nerves. Pulling a brush through my hair, I tried not to think about the fact that I'd borrowed it from Jamie, or how she would have winced at the knowledge of what I was about to do. She'd loved Chris before I ever came to Barron County, loved him and lost him, and a small part of that would never heal. I never pressed Chris on how far he and Jamie had gone, it wasn't my business, and besides, I didn't want to make an already uncomfortable situation worse. However, it did make me nervous, thinking about what Jamie, with her beautiful curves and long bleach blonde hair, would have worn to bed on a night like this. Even if we're not going to do anything, I wouldn't have minded some advance warning so I could find something in the market sexier than this. This shirt is way too baggy. I look like a homeless. Coming around the curtain, I stopped dead in my tracks, and the air stuck in my throat. Chris stood with his back to me across the room, wearing a pair of polyester black athletic shorts, having just tugged off his own shirt. He clearly hadn't detected the light footfalls of my sock feet on the rough sawn floor and was busy searching in his own footlocker for a suitable replacement. I'd never seen him shirtless before, and while a tiny part of my brain huffed with annoyance at my own rudeness, the rest of me stared, unable to stop myself. Lit by the flickering of the surrounding candles, his chiseled torso was a rolling tapestry of muscle, toned and sleek, like something off a men's fitness magazine. I'd seen him work with the other men before, fought alongside him enough to know his strength, but in this light, it made my head spin. Chris's skin gleamed, smooth as silk in the light, stretched over mountains of sinew and tendon that could have broken me in half like a twig if he wanted to. Stitched over this, I noted the many scars that marked him in jagged little slices, raised bits of torn skin that had sewn itself back together over time. Some were rather large, one on his right shoulder almost as long as my hand, while others were small, but I had no doubt they'd all hurt when they were new. It reminded me that Chris had spent 2 weeks in the abyssal nightmare of the forest alone after his helicopter was shot down, and the untold horrors he'd seen were evidenced in his ragged flesh. Finding a shirt, Chris turned, his eyes focused on his hands, and my muddled brain threatened to go into meltdown over the rest of him. While our borderline starvation rations at New Wilderness had always been a drag, it had certainly done him massive favors, the surface of his stomach flat save for the slight ripples of his abdominal muscles. Both Chris's arms were taut with more bulges, and a light coat of curly brown hair covered his broad chest. "Breathe, come on Hannah, you need to breathe." At last, Chris noticed me standing there, and he paused halfway through finding the armholes of his shirt to return my stare. I found myself baffled as his sky-blue eyes traveled the length of my diminutive frame with a hungry glint. On the heels of his devouring gaze, I was suddenly conscious of the air on my legs, how the thin shorts didn't quite reach my mid-thigh, and that the baggy shirt I'd fretted over wasn't so baggy as to hide me completely. Sure, I still didn't feel the wave of confidence needed to hurl myself at him with primal desire, but with how he looked at me in that moment, it seemed as though I was the only girl on earth. No one had ever looked at me like that. Heat pooled in my core, static roared in my brain, and my pulse jumped under my skin with adrenaline, as I dared to let my thoughts wander, dared to imagine taking that shirt away from him and rattle, rattle, rattle. On the small propane burner at his desk, the stainless steel cooking pot hissed steam from under its lid, and Chris yanked his shirt on, crossing the space to tend to it. "Soup's done." Sucking in a gasp, I forced my racing heart to slow and padded over to the 2 stools he had set up for us. I wasn't hungry but made myself eat anyway, and the delicious combination of starchy noodles, chopped vegetables, and salty chicken helped to untangle the knots in my gut. At the very least, I ended up yawning once or twice before the meal ended, and noticed Chris do the same. With the soup gone, Chris stoked the fire in the stove and strode to the conversion couch to peel back the covers on the pullout. Turning to me, he flushed an adorable shade of crimson and cleared his throat. "Ladies first." Climbing in, I felt my heart pound in excited, if nervous beats, and let him pull me close as he got in beside me. I'd thought of us together many times before, admittedly with more than some innocent cuddling going on in my mind, but with how awful today had been, this was a welcome reprieve. He smelled of the same kind of homemade soap everyone used at the fort, a slightly oaky scent due to the wood vats used to make it. The gray cotton shirt he wore was soft against my skin, and I felt shivers of pleasant warmth flow through me as we settled down together beneath the blankets. "You comfy?" he whispered and stroked my hair in a way that turned my mind to mush. "Comfy doesn't even come close to what this is." "Yeah." With a contented sigh, I dared to hitch one leg around his waist and relished how it felt to have his body against mine, the two of us as close as the thin material of our garments would let us be. We lay there in the shadow of the dying candles, and for a while, neither of us spoke. Chris rubbed at my back between the shoulder blades, and I listened to the muffled echo of his heart beating beneath my ear, like a dull tom-tom drum encased with muscle. I never understood how it felt for her not to pull the trigger on me. Chris broke the silence at last, staring up at the ceiling above us with a brooding look. "Never imagined it could be like this. After all that, everything that we went through, the last thing she'll remember me for is that I failed her." Tightening my arms around him, I craned my head back to see his face. "You defended her. That's what she'll remember. You were loyal, even when it could have cost you everything. A good man protects his own." Chris sighed bitterly. "I didn't protect her, just staved off the inevitable. It would have been a mercy to shoot Jamie instead of leaving her to starve, or freeze, or..." Unable to bear the despair in his voice, I climbed over him and took his face in my hands to bring our lips together. It sent delicious lightning through my blood, but I pushed the primal urge away to focus on caressing his mouth with mine, telling him how much I loved him, needed him, believed in him, without any words. I tasted the salt of tears, knew they were his, and tightened all four limbs around him with iron certainty. I slid my fingers through his soft, mousy hair, gripped his waist with my legs, and poured my broken heart into every motion, even as hot droplets slid down my own face. He hadn't betrayed Jamie. I had. He hadn't let her down. I had. I'd stolen her life, her love, her chance at freedom, and I would be damned if I let him suffer for it. How does it hurt more when the tears are his? When the kiss ended, I rested my forehead against his, and looked down into Chris's eyes, sky blue seas of sorrow that made my heart twinge in guilt. "I did this. Not you. The blood is on my hands." Circled around me in a wall of silk-coated iron, his arms kept me pressed to his chest, and Chris swallowed hard, blinking at his internal misgivings. "I don't want you to bear that burden alone. You've borne it enough." Wiping at the remnants of his rare tears, I shook my head, the long rivulets of my brown hair falling around our faces in a shroud, the golden streaks highlighted like stars in the candlelight. "More than enough. This place, these people, they need you, Chris. You can't just give up now that we're so close to the end." He ran a gentle set of fingers through my tangled locks, and I couldn't help but shiver in delight at how good it felt. "They need us. You have a longer shadow than you realize, Hannah. The resistance in Black Oak, the missile silo, all of that happened because of you. I'm head ranger because of you. The thing that scares me now, the part that I dread more than anything, is the possibility that once of these days I might lose you too." He's scared. God, that's terrifying. I've never seen him like this before. "I'm not going anywhere." I stubbornly shook my head, but he simply raised one brown eyebrow at me. "You didn't plan on getting stabbed by Vesatoric either. He's still out there, Elsar still has 3 times our number, and the breach is still growing in strength. Thousands are going to die in this war, and if one of us doesn't come back, then you leave. I forced the words from myself, determined not to envision a future without him, even if it meant seeing the opposite, one where he had to live on in my absence. You can slip across the border, go to your house in Pennsylvania, maybe get your old job back. If this place goes under, if I'm gone, why stay? Chris glared at me, not with anger so much as despair at the potential misfortune he'd envisioned. We all go home, or no one does. I recognized the words Jamie had spoken on Maple Lake, knew they meant more to both Chris and I than either of us could express. Despite my wish to see him safe, to see him happy, to spare the man I loved from a war that could take everything he had left away, I couldn't fight him on that. As long as you're here, it's home. Sliding onto the bed by his side, I nestled my head in the nape of his neck, and watched a nearby candle fizzle out. Then we win this, together. You and me. For Jamie's sake. Chris didn't reply, but with how he rolled onto his side to crush me against his chest again, cradled me in his arms, I knew it was a yes. The fire crackled, the candle slowly burned out, but even as the room fell into cozy shadows, I found myself wide awake in Chris's arms. Our offensive was in 2 days, tomorrow for prep, the next day for launch. Countless deaths would likely result, and I wondered how many of the teenagers in my platoon would be part of that number. What would I do if Lucille was killed? What would I tell Andrea? How would I live with myself if all the people I loved and respected were consumed by the ugly maw of this conflict? What would I do if, in the end, I was left all alone in the woods, with only the dead and the breach to keep me company? Burying my face in his shirt, I screwed my eyes shut and tried not to think about it as the hands on Chris's watch slowly counted down to morning. You've got your canteen, right? I glanced over Jamie's war belt, heart aching within my ribcage. Her wry features shrouded in the hood of her overcoat, Jamie made a weary grin, and her words became fog in the morning sunlight. You asked that already? It was a cold sunrise, the grass glittered with a shiny coat of frost, but the wind from the night prior had died at last. I could see our breath in the air, swirls of steam that reminded me of tiny ghosts, flying away on the breeze. The huge camp lay quiet, much of the population still asleep after last night's tumultuous events, though various flying creatures sang from the nearby trees. Few of us had come to escort Jamie out the eastern gate, and while I was glad for the lack of a crowd, it hurt in the pit of my stomach that this was really happening. She had been the one to take me in at the start, taught me everything, and now Jamie Lanson would be jettisoned into the dark, cruel unknown of the forest, all alone. If she can make it to the water, she might stand a chance. That's assuming Vesatoric can't swim or build a boat. If he caught her. A hand on my arm made me jump, and I looked up to see her emerald green eyes watching me with resigned sadness. I'm going to be fine. Jamie shrugged, though the truth of her own reservations floated behind her thin smile. Seriously, it's not like we haven't done this before. Before it was temporary. I folded my arms to keep from shaking, both from the stiffness of the icy morning, and my own deep-seated fear. And we were together. Where will you go? Jamie looked over her shoulder at the group that waited for us by the gate and flexed a set of fingers on the strap of her AK. Peter drew a map for me, said there's some small islets on Maple Lake that should be good for building a hideout. I figure if I can knock together a canoe or something, I can live off fish and gulls for a while, maybe drop a few deer for winter. All I gotta worry about then is not freezing to death. Her weak expression faded at that, and Jamie stroked a small woodcutting axe that I'd bought for her from the market after the trial, no doubt thinking about how much work she'd have to do just to keep a fire going through the snowy months. The Ark River folks had mountains of firewood stacked within our walls, but even then, they burned sparingly, as we all knew the winter would likely be rougher than usual thanks to the breach. She doesn't even have a proper tent. Building a hut that can withstand the winter could take days, maybe weeks, and if the inland sea freezes over, she won't be able to fish without hacking deep holes through the ice. If Jamie can't get enough calories, she won't be able to keep warm, and then. In stubborn horror at my own thoughts, I shook my head to dig in my war belt pouch. I've got some more cartridges, why don't you take them and. Jamie closed her hand over mine to keep the bullets where they were. I've got enough. Seriously, hang on to your ammo. You're going to need it. At that, we both glanced toward the distant motor pool, where the fleet of armored trucks and other vehicles lay in wait. Ethan's crew had spent a good portion of the night after the trial had ended getting them ready. Soon we would drive from the fort with every fighter we could spare, and lunge northward to do battle with Elsar directly. Our success could bring an end to the war. Our failure, on the other hand, would mean certain death. A cold chill ran up my arms, leaving goosebumps on the skin beneath my coat sleeves, and I tugged my hood closer around my face. I wish you were coming with us. Jamie winked and took my arm to steer us toward the gate. You'll be all right. I've got faith in you. There's not a bullet made yet that can catch Hannah the mutant killer. I chuckled, though my heart wasn't in it, and we strode on to where the others waited. First on the way, Sarah met us, and handed each a handheld yellow plastic box with a metal antenna in the end. Here. Our technicians rigged these up from some civil defense surplus radios we scrounged months ago. They spliced in some tiny solar panels in the back from old outdoor patio lights, so it can trickle charge during the day. It's not great, but it should allow you to call from several miles away at least, and that way you can keep tabs on each other. Her expression was one of remorse as she held one of the radios out to Jamie, and from the redness around Sarah's eyes, I could tell she'd been crying. Her faction already had a nasty reputation thanks to Sarah's predecessor, Dr. O'Brien, turning traitor, and Sarah still dealt with the fallout of that to this day. Being on the panel that convicted Jamie had earned her a few more enemies, and I could tell that she hadn't felt good about it. Scientist or no, Sandra was still a human being, and this horrible war had taken its toll on her as much as it had the rest of us. With that in mind, I accepted my radio with a grateful nod. Thank you. Jamie slipped hers into her pack, and flashed Sarah a debonair grin. Here's to hoping I use it a lot, yeah. Here's to hoping. From behind Sarah came Sean, his movie star handsome face reddened with the morning's chill. He too wore an expression that bordered on regret, though his was more stoic, and Sean offered out a bundle wrapped in scrap cloth. Pulled some jerky from the ration stores for you, and some potatoes. Should get you through 4 or 5 days at least, enough for you to get a decent shelter rigged up. Somewhat surprised, Jamie's face flushed, and she cradled the food in her arms with a meek nod. I'll build a guest room for you then, boss. His stony countenance slipped a little at her plucky humor, and Sean winced. I wish it didn't have to be this way, Lanson. You've done what you had to. She met his eyes with a generous tone and angled her head toward the rows of tents and cabins within the walls. Someone's got to lead these people, after all. Randy would be proud. Sean's mouth twitched into a sad half-smile. Bill would be too. A long moment lapsed between them, like ice frozen in the air. Her eyes glistened with crystalline emotion, and Jamie snapped her free arm into a rigid salute. It was an honor, sir. At that, Sean's dark irises watered, but he returned a salute of his own and let us move on down the line. Ethan had a compass for her that he'd salvaged from an old travel van. Eve gifted her a small pouch for Jamie's war belt that was filled with little medical vials of lantern rose nectar, and Adam handed her a fishing pole that could be broken down into 3 short pieces for storage. Peter of course gifted the handmade map from the Harper's Vengeance and teased Jamie with his famous coin-in-the-ear trick one last time. Like the others, they each expressed their sympathies for the terrible situation we'd all been forced into, and Jamie graciously did her best to wave off the obvious sadness we all felt. Last to meet us before the tall iron facets of the eastern gate stood Chris. With the slanted golden rays of the rising sun to his right, Chris seemed stuck to the spot, his scruffy face ringed with dark bags under his sky blue eyes. Maple syrup-colored hair stood up in places from where he'd tossed and turned all night, same as I had. Despite all this, he was as handsome as he first day we'd met, and I could tell it wasn't lost on Jamie either for how she jolted to a halt in her tracks, their eyes locked. The brave veneer of faux indifference wavered on Jamie's pixie-like features, and pain flickered there, dredged up from wounds that had never fully healed. She needs this. Jamie deserves to say whatever she has to. She did it for me, after all. I gave her a gentle nudge forward, and made a warm smile at her uncertain glance to let her know it was all right. Go on. It's okay, really. I'll wait here. Her lower lip trembled, but Jamie slowly trudged over to Chris and set her backpack down on the ground beside her. Chris opened his mouth to speak, then shut it again, dropping his gaze to his boots. It hurt to see them like this, not in the old jealous way I'd felt before I knew the truth, but in the agonizing torture of watching my two best friends suffer from the scars of their past. There was nothing I could do to make it better, I knew that, and remained a respectful distance away with a silent prayer on my lips that somehow they might find a sense of peace. So Jamie tried to clear her throat, unable to meet Chris's eye. I guess this is. Without a word, Chris pulled her into a fierce embrace, and Jamie shattered like glass. Even from where I stood, I could see her shoulders quake from the sobs, and Chris's stoic face moist with rare tears. They clung to each other in a hair-trending despair that I couldn't feel threatened by for how hopeless it was, the last dying gasps of a dream that was never meant to be. Their whispers were likely inaudible to the others, but with my advanced hearing, I picked up every word. I heard you're going south. He offered the words like a flag of truce from behind a barricade. That's smart, the water will make being stealthy easier. Maybe you can head west for Sunbright, and try to slip past the border guards when the fog sets in. Jamie laughed, though it was barely a chuckle between heartbroken sniffles. You aren't getting rid of me that easy. I'll stick it out somewhere on the lake. Build myself a mansion on the waterfront and get fat on wild ducks. Chris paused, his frown one of deep reservation. Jamie. Don't. She hugged him tighter, and something in Jamie's voice cracked with the finality of her circumstances, a knowledge that there would be no turning back from this. I'm not leaving, not like that. You wouldn't, so don't you dare lecture me now. More quiet tension reigned, and from how it rendered through their body language, I sensed something rising, like an ancient volcano whose eruption was long overdue. I'm sorry. Chris breathed with a defeated note in his soft accent, both eyes squeezed shut. Me too. Jamie rested her head on his shoulder, her face buried in the thick lapel of Chris's jacket. From behind the folds of my coat hood, I felt the corners of my mouth turn slightly upwards, even if the effort was in mourning. There it was, after all this time. I knew it wasn't merely an apology for the trial, or the incident with Dr. O'Brien, this was deeper, stemming back to more than I knew, to hurts and betrayals that predated me in this forgotten place. For so long they'd held those scars against each other, and at last, both seemed willing to let it go. Chris and Jamie held each other in silence for a few seconds, before they broke apart, each wiping at their face with their coat sleeves. As she picked up her pack, I caught Chris's eye over Jamie's shoulder, and he gave me a grateful nod. My heart both twinged in pain and soared for how he looked at me, knowing then that I'd done the right thing. Chris was mine, had been from the start, but he'd needed to find that closure with Jamie for a long time. At least now, whatever came next, he might not feel as guilty. At the end of the lane, only Jamie and I remained, under the shadow of the gate. I had done everything to prepare myself for this moment, but now that it was here, a weight of grief settled over me in a cascade of brutal intensity. She flexed her neck to crack it, and Jamie turned to face me with a shuddery breath. Call you when I get there, then. It sounds so much worse when you say it like that. I flung my arms around her, and Jamie gripped me so tight I thought my ribs would snap, our tears soaking each other's shoulders. If you go out there and die on me, I'll kick your ass. Sure you will. Jamie giggled and pulled back to hold my gaze, with a nod back to where Chris watched us. Take care of him. He might be a pretentious fool at times, but he's still a great guy, and he'd be lost without you. A ghost of a smile tried to play about my lips, but another thought struck me, and I turned to rummage around in my deep jacket pockets. There is one more thing. From within the oversized Carhartt, I produced the photograph of her and her brother, Bill. However, the frame now also had another picture taped to the side of it, a glossy black Polaroid I'd gotten at my surprise birthday party all those nights ago in New Wilderness, showing Jamie and I laughing on the dance floor together. I saved this for you, back in New Wilderness. Now wherever you go, I go. Jamie's eyes swam with fresh tears, and she choked back a wave of emotion to shake her head at me. Why, you're too good for this awful place. We embraced one final time, and Jamie clutched the picture with a white-knuckled grip. Thank you, Hannah. She whispered. I watched her go, my heart tearing in two as the heavy gate swung shut behind her with a solemn thud. Just before she reached the distant trees, Jamie turned once to look back our way, and then the forest swallowed her up. Chris's hand worked into mine, and I turned to rest my head against his shoulder, fighting the urge to break down all over again. She'll be fine. He grunted, though I sensed it was just as much to himself as to me. Jamie is smart. I'm sure we'll hear from her within a few days. And if she runs into Vesitoruk? Or a pack of birch crawlers? We'd never know, never hear the screams, not find so much as her shoes to bury. Decker, Brun. Sean's voice snapped me from my droll thoughts as the others dispersed. We've got a conference in my tent in 5 minutes. I need you both there. Chris gave my hand a squeeze, his breath warm on my ear. Ready? I looked at the gate, a small part of me wishing it would open, and Jamie would come strolling back inside with a quirky grin on her face to say it was all a practical joke. My world had changed again with the extinction, another part of it that I loved, needed, depended on every day. First it was my home, my parents, even Matt and Carla. Now, I'd lost Jamie, New Wilderness lay in ruins, and we were about to march to war. I had no idea if I would even come back from it, if a shell, bullet, or grenade would cut me down somewhere in the northern section of Barron County. My entire life, what was left of it, hung in the balance. A cool breeze sprung up to slide its invisible fingers through my hair, a few strands of gold playing amongst the brown before my eyes. You are different, Hannah. The stranger in the chemical suit's words floated through my mind again, calming my nerves, soothing the pain in my chest, giving me purpose. I wouldn't let this sacrifice be in vain. Jamie believed in me, she always had. If I could find a way to stop whatever calamity awaited us all beyond fate's horizon, then I would give my life to do so, for her sake. Gripping Chris's palm in mine, I nodded and turned my back on the eastern gate. Let's go. The makeshift headquarters for our tiny alliance was already packed by the time we arrived, and I found myself standing beside the rest of the officials, along with the other lieutenants from both our Rangers and Ark Rivers forces. All in all, we squeezed into the crowded olive green surplus tent, around a rectangular folding table where Sean spread out a large paper map of Barron County. Our plan is to move fast, up the lesser-used secondary roads, to put Black Oak in a pincer. He placed wooden tokens on the map to signify various units and moved them into position as he spoke. Our scouts will lead the way through the marshlands in the north, and we will take the enemy by surprise. Hit-and-run attacks will wear down their outer defenses, including outposts and patrol bases, leaving the city exposed. Our guns can help breach the outer walls, and once inside, we will secure the warehouses, weapons depots, and headquarters respectively. If we can close with their heavy armor before it can deploy, we can overwhelm it. Without those, Elsar won't be able to maintain their defense, and will be forced to withdraw. Sean gestured to Sarah and pointed to a cluster of buildings on the map. Our researchers will send medical aid teams to occupy these abandoned buildings in a chain down the valley, allowing us to relay wounded to Ark River in rapid fashion. Each stronghold will be heavily defended by machine guns and flamethrowers, enough to keep both mutants and Elsar at bay. I take it that's where my boys come in. Ethan scratched his chin, both arms folded in contemplation. Correct. Aside from securing our main supply route, your workers will form the bulk of our regular forces behind the Rangers. Sean slid his forefinger along the winding road leading from Black Oak to the interior of the county. They'll be key in organizing our logistics as well as casualty evacuation. Advanced combat units will be small and mobile, to keep enemy drones, artillery, or aircraft from targeting them. We Rangers will be on the front line then. Chris hooked both thumbs into his belt, shifted on his feet. With our riders, of course. Adam answered instead of Sean this time, one hand resting idly on the hilt of his cruciform sword. Our men are ready to take the fight to the enemy. With our deer, we can move easily through the swamps, and circle around them to cut off supply lines. Sean nodded his dark-haired head and pushed a few tokens around on the map to indicate the aforementioned movements. Ark River will serve as harassment and scouting parties to keep them guessing as to where our main force is. Our Rangers will act as shock troops to crack Elsar's main defensive line and connect with the resistance members inside Black Oak. From where I stood, I chewed the inside of my cheek with a mild frown, as a realization settled in. In all these complex war plans, no one had mentioned the puppet army yet. True, Elsar was a massive threat, but the Mutant King posed no less of a danger, and he could be anywhere outside the protective walls of Ark River. Man, I hate being the one to do this. I swallowed hard and dared to raise my voice. What about Vesitoruk? All eyes turned to me, and embarrassed heat flooded my face. Even now, after all the things I'd done, risks I'd taken, victories I'd had, speaking in front of others still made my guts churn. Chris was perfect for this kind of thing, governing, making big decisions, debating people. I preferred to go on patrols with my little platoon, where the choices were simple, the rules easy to follow, and the world, though cruel, made sense. Once we take Black Oak, we'll have a fortress so strong even he couldn't breach it. Sean tapped his finger on the borders of the city. As soon as Elsar is pushed to the county line, we can range into the center of the county to look for Vesitoruk. Regardless of when, our main problem will be finding him. His forces have disappeared. Next to her husband, Eve scowled at the map in thought, the enmity between the Mold King and the Ark River people almost as personal as my own due to Vesitoruk's enslavement of their unredeemed kin. Even in their natural state, the Lost Ones shouldn't be able to conceal so many of their own within the forests, especially not without leaving enough sign for us to track. It's as if they all turned invisible. If anyone could hide that well, it would be them. I met her gaze, curious at hearing my own thoughts voiced from another person, and eager to try and solve them now that I had more allies in this task. Maybe they dug some kind of underground tunnel system to hide in. I suppose it's possible. Eve shrugged her narrow shoulders and brushed a stray lock of golden hair from her equally luminous eyes. But what tracks we do find keep appearing in random places, far from each other, and with no burrows or holes anywhere nearby. That much movement means they can't be spending enough time digging to build a tunnel network big enough to hide them all. They can't be covering the distance on foot either, we'd find the tracks. Heart pounding at the way everyone else waited on me to make my point, I stepped closer to the table and swept the faded paper map with my gaze in hopes of finding solutions. I think he's getting ready to make a move. Vesitoruk has to be watching us just like we're hunting for him, and if he's hiding his movements, it can only mean he's preparing something he doesn't want us to see. We can't leave him in our rear area, or he'll pick off our supply trucks one by one. Ethan jerked a thumb over his shoulder. We can load down the trucks with extra supplies, so we don't have to run so many convoys back and forth. It'll keep our footprint low and make it harder for Elsar to track us by air. The Mold King surely can't keep up with our convoys. His birch crawlers can. Chris's eyes collided with mine from across the table in a knowing look, and he shook his head. He's smart. Last time he set an ambush to immobilize our trucks, because he knows they can't catch us on the open road. Hannah's right, Vesitoric needs to be neutralized first. Sarah rested her hands on both hips. Should we though? I mean, last time we lost quite a few men, and from what the survivors said, Vesitoric managed to exert some kind of telepathic influence to stun them. Only Hannah wasn't affected. That earned even more intense stares, the others eyeing my silver tattoos that ran across the right side of my face in silent uncertainty. Yeah, that's me, the freak of nature. Sean rubbed his chiseled jaw, and sighed. If we can't find him, we can't hit him. You make a valid point, Brun, but if we don't move on Black Oak before they deploy those tanks, the war is over. Once we get Elsar out of Barren County, we can link up with the resistance and turn all our forces on Vesitoric. Biting my lip, I forced myself to nod, my chest deflated in acknowledgement that he was right. I couldn't expect the world to stop just because I had a different opinion, but the thought of driving north to fight Elsar in the woods, while the shadowy priest of doom stalked me like a tiger in the long grass made my skin crawl. Even the ego-fueled head of Elsar, George Coranti, wanted to keep the breach and its denizens contained, to prevent them from spreading beyond Barren County into the rest of the world. Vesitoric was the walking embodiment of the threat imposed on our planet by the breach, and while I knew a bullet could stop Coranti, I had yet to think of anything that could put the Mold King down. After all, the freak had taken a gunshot to the chest and walked it off like a mosquito bite. If Vesitoric was truly immortal, how on earth were we going to stop him if we did find him? In a subconscious reflex, I glanced around to look for Jamie's reaction, and felt a pang of loneliness at remembering that I didn't have her to rely on anymore. Like so many of the people I'd come to know when I arrived at New Wilderness, Jamie Lanson had been ripped out of my life, and while she wasn't dead yet, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered the word I feared the most. Yet. Right then, any further questions? I looked up to find the meeting over, having continued on in my mental absence, and shook my head along with the others. Chris would relay any orders I needed to know for my platoon, and I wanted to use today to catch up on some rest, as we would be moving out the following dawn. As I turned to leave with the crowd, Sean's voice stopped me. Lieutenant Brun? A moment. Chris paused at the tent door frame and gave my arm a discreet squeeze. I'll be outside. Figure I can help get your boys squared away, then you can get some shut-eye before the big push. Go on. Already tired just thinking about the amount of work required to prepare my men for tomorrow morning, I returned to the table, Sean and I alone in the dim canvas shelter. He leaned one hand on the map table and Sean ran one set of fingers through his hair dark in exhaustion. There is an additional assignment I have for you. One that we have to keep between ourselves. It's a matter of defense secrets. I stiffened a little at that, the words eerily familiar to me for how often they'd related to horrible events in the past. Of course, sir. In a secretive hunch, Sean leaned closer and lowered his voice. We need to have a team of researchers and rangers on standby inside Silo 48, in case we have to launch on short notice. If Elsar got their hands on the nukes, we'd be done for. Your platoon will escort the team to the bunker, and get them settled in, then, you'll continue on with your official mission to reconnoiter the north. We are going to use them, then. Disturbed at that concept, I glanced down at the map, noting the empty green patch where I knew the bunker lay. So, who's going to get the launch keys? They're going to need both, which is going to mean a massive security risk. I'd say Chris would be a good choice, but we'll need him in the field. Sarah told me her crew analyzed the documents you brought back from the bunker, and apparently, they think there's a way to convert one of the auxiliary control panels to a remote launch shortwave system. His mahogany-colored irises eyes scanned the inked hills, trees, and ridges, as if already searching for invisible enemies. It would help us keep the launch capabilities mobile with us and ensure that neither Elsar nor Vesitoric could overwhelm the facility by sheer force to use the missiles. Once the team reaches the bunker, they can convert the panel, pre-install the keys, and hand it off to you. Time seemed to stop, the air caught in my lungs, and I swayed on my heels. Me. Sean gave me a small, proud smile. You're one of the few people I know would never hand it over to Elsar, and Vesitoric's abilities don't work on you. The safety of the device is paramount. Once you have the panel, you'll proceed north and rendezvous with my convoy, and I'll take it from there. Last time I carried something that important, I almost got killed 3 different times. Pulse roaring in my temple, I shook my head. Sir, with all due respect, why not keep the keys inside the bunker? No one else knows it's there, it'd be far safer. Our platoon could be destroyed, I could be captured. And so could the bunker. Sean's hard gaze caught and held mine, and he folded both massive arms to accentuate his point. The garrison there will be given charges to install, to blow up the missiles in case they are overrun. You will destroy the launch panel and keys if you believe capture draws near. But why bother if we can't even use them? I dug my thumbnail into my hip to prevent myself from breaking out into a nervous sweat at the authority being entrusted to me. I mean, Chris and I have talked about it, and he said he didn't think there was a situation where the nukes can help us. We can't launch on Black Oak, it'd lose us the war. If we fail, either Elsar or Vesitoric will swarm over Barren County. Sean gestured at the map with a broad arc of his hand. Vesitoric might even cover the world, if he succeeds. If the day comes when our defeat is all but certain, we'll send the missiles into the sky and bring them back down on Barren County to wipe the slate clean once and for all. Mother of God. My stomach clenched, the enormity of that like a truck on my intestines. You mean kill everyone? His hand rested on my shoulder, heavy, but compassionate, calloused from many days of brutal manual labor at the reserve. Elsar we can survive, they are men, corrupt and evil, but men nonetheless. They can be fought, or brought to justice if possible, but Vesitoric? A nuclear warhead would be a mercy compared to whatever he has in store. So, it's a fail-safe? A last resort? We won't actually use it, right? I angled my head to plead with Sean, peering into his dark eyes in hopes of securing a form of comfort at my chilling orders. Sean's features drew into a grim resignation that didn't inspire any sort of optimism. I hope not, Hannah, but those missiles are the only sure thing we have to stand between us, and total oblivion. That's why I had to overlook your objections earlier. I can't have you hunting Vesitoric down when I need your help securing those nukes. Moreover, if the times comes to act, and I'm not able to, you will be the only person authorized to issue a launch command. Circling back behind the table, Sean reclined into a small folding chair and rested both arms on the table before him, fingers interlaced. I know you understand just how important this is. Decker seemed to think you were up to the challenge when I asked him about it in private, so I won't order you to do it. I want you to go on your own volition. If you don't want the job, I'll try to find someone else, though I can't honestly say I'd be that confident in another choice. It's up to you, Brun. Can you do this for me? I stood, stock still, frozen in the moment. How long ago had I been offered such a petrifying choice by our commander, in his old office at New Wilderness, when I first chose the Rangers as my home faction? Jamie had been at my side then, cheered me on, guided me to make the right call. Now I stood alone in front of Sean, with no one to advise me but myself. It was the biggest responsibility of my life, and one that shook me to the bone. To be able to launch a nuclear strike, to obliterate all of Barron County in the blink of an eye, to disintegrate both friend and foe in one last doomed stand was nightmarish to think of, but I knew that Sean was right. True bravery is being willing to do hard things for the good of others. As fresh as the day I'd heard it after being rescued from LSAR headquarters, Kaba's voice echoed from my memories, one of many people in my journey who had put their life on the line for me. I couldn't let them all down, not now. With a practiced rigidity, I straightened to give Sean a salute that would have made Jamie proud. "Consider it done, sir." Golden sunlight streamed down from overhead, a warm reprieve from the chill of the late fall day, but I couldn't enjoy it for the deep boom booms that echoed in the distance. Eagle 5, good effect on target 100/100. Rhino 1 actual, out. My chest cramped at the sound of Chris's voice over the radio headset, and my nervous heart skipped a beat. They'd been shelling an LSAR sentry post for the past few minutes, and if the field guns we'd built at New Wilderness had been called off, it meant they'd done their job well. I wanted to believe that Chris and his soldiers weren't in any danger, but I knew better. Even here, a few miles away, I could feel the crump of more gun batteries sending their final volley into the sky, and my heightened senses could pick up the faint taste of smoke on the breeze. Once I meet up with Sean, I can go check on Chris. He's got to report into HQ at some point, right? I need to see him, just once, just to be sure. Biting my lower lip in frustration, I kicked at a muddy tire on my battered green SUV. As we weren't meant to take part in frontline combat, not yet anyway, our platoon had received unarmored regular civilian vehicles patched together from spare parts instead of the up-armored trucks which were in short supply. They ran, which was a miracle and a half, but staring at my meager convoy with the sound of distant gunfire in my ears only accentuated my unease. Sure, I had no desire to go back into combat, with bullets snapping by my head, and bombs raining from the sky, but I hated being stuck in the rear while Chris and the others risked their lives. Man, it just doesn't stop. Lucille heft my camera in her hands and shuddered at the machine gun fire on the horizon. Standing at the edge of the field, I nodded, and watched the silo team lower supplies down the access hatch with ropes. Silo 48 lay concealed beneath a flat, grassy meadow, but despite the sunshine, the distant chirping of birds in the trees, I couldn't shake the queasiness from the pit of my gut that this place gave me. We'd scanned for radiation 3 times, but the researchers of the silo team concluded that, though there were strange variations in the background radiation, none of it was at a harmful level. Still, my camera screen had twitched when I turned it on, and I didn't plan on using it long here, just in case some unseen electromagnetic energy damaged it. Still, better to get some footage now, just in case. I turned to Lucille, and eyed the camera lens pointed my way, the feeling of being in front of the camera for a change bizarre. We won't be here long, so if you've got anything that needs doing, do it now. Once the team is settled in, we're heading north to meet up with headquarters. Anything we run into, we call into Sean, and wait for backup. Lucille yawned and itched at the back of her neck. You think we'll see any action? Prying clumps of mud from my boot on the bumper of my command vehicle, I tried to ignore the nervous butterflies in my stomach. Probably. With how few of us there are overall, I don't think we'll be able to stay out of it forever. Let's just hope LSAR isn't expecting us. Her eyes hardened with that knowledge, and Lucille lowered my camera to cock her head to one side. Do you think we could find a way to contact Andrea once we get close to the walls? We'll definitely try. I plucked a strand of the nearby tall grass and started to shred it with my thumbnail. She's one of the few leaders they've got left, so I figure once we make contact with their units, she'll hear about it. Maybe when that happens, we can send her a message just from you. That, of course, was a half-truth. I had no idea if Andrea was alive or dead, but I needed Lucille at her best, along with all my platoon, and she seemed to accept the idea readily enough. Right now, our survival mattered more, and that meant keeping my crew focused. Sparrow 1 actual, this is Hornet 1 actual, we need you below decks. One of the researchers' voices crackled through the radio headset over my ears, and I pushed off from the well-worn SUV to head for the hatchway. I'm on my way. I clicked the mic, then turned to Lucille, and motioned for the convoy. Stow the camera and be ready to move out. We don't want to be late. It took a few minutes to clamber down into the dark maw of the nuclear missile silo from the long ladder at the hatch, but soon I found myself at the bottom and worked my way past the mounted boxes of supplies into the interior. Researchers and a few guard rangers were there, mostly hard at work checking the various panels, the electrical system all lit up after the lead scientists managed to get the generator back online. The garrison mainly consisted of people unfit for combat, the elderly, younger children, and a few people with acute medical conditions. Only the handful of guards were able-bodied, and even then, these were all teens below the age of 14, with aged weapons and sullen frowns. They'd been ordered to hide behind the sturdy blast doors of the bunker until receiving further instructions from Sean, and while the bunker's heating system warmed the facility to pre-breach levels of comfort, it was still a dark, gloomy place to stay. The lead researcher met me halfway down the flight of steps to the lower level of the control room, a green canvas sling bag in his wizened hands. An older man in his mid-70s, his wrinkled face was somewhat pale, but he handed it to me without fanfare, along with 2 familiar silver keys on the end of a small metallic chain. Everything should be in order. He glanced at the bundle in my hands, and the old man rubbed at his skinny arm in nervousness. There's an instruction manual in there too, just the basics I clipped out of a larger one. It's a fairly advanced trajectory calculation system for the time period, mostly analog, but not so complex that we'll need satellite guidance. Most targets already have preset coordinates built in, based off Cold War priority lists. There's even a talk function where the machine repeats pre-recorded commands through a speaker, the best they could get before artificial voice synthesis. We'll have 24 missiles in total, all that can launch within 5 minutes. I swallowed hard, and fought the urge to throw the panel as far from myself as possible. Thanks. As I turned to leave, the elderly scientist called out to me one more time. Lieutenant? This whole thing, it's silly, isn't it? I mean, they're not actually going to use them, right? Your guess is as good as mine. Unsure of what to say, I paused at the foot of the ladder, but couldn't find the strength to formulate a convincing lie. Instead, I simply climbed back up the cold metal ladder, and into the sunlit world of the surface. On the road once more, my radio crackled to life as our trucks bumped along a rutted, narrow secondary lane. All units, this is Rhino 1 actual. Chris's voice echoed through the radio headsets, low and serious. Objective is secure. We are Oscar Mike. My shoulders relaxed, and I let out a long sigh of relief. Our radio traffic had to be disguised, in case LSAR intercepted it, but soon they would know we were coming for them. The trick would be to stay ahead of their aircraft, artillery, and recon units long enough to destroy their outposts, and render them blind to everything outside the walls of Black Oak. All the regular line units were Rhinos, Sean was Hilltop, and the Ark River fighters were Stags. The bunker team were all Hornets given the speed and sting of their hidden weapons, and our artillery were Eagles. My platoon, being one of 3 advanced scout units not from Ark River, was designated Sparrow 1, and I clicked my mic to render my pre-arranged call sign. Hilltop, this is Sparrow 1, we are Oscar Mike from the Hornet's Nest, how copy, over. Solid copy Sparrow 1, rendezvous with me at rally point 12. Hilltop out. Tracing my fingers over a ragged topographical map I kept folded within a protective screen of clear cellophane, I tapped the location with my finger, and waved at the road ahead. All right Charlie, we're going to take the next right, and stay on that road for 3 miles. Driving through the ruined countryside of Barron County had always been surreal for its post-human desolation, but as we drew closer to the ever-shifting front lines, we found new additions to the tapestry of death: burning LSAR vehicles, smoldering ruins of sandbag outposts, and the motionless corpses of dead soldiers left to bloat in the sun. Most were far enough off the road to where we only caught glimpses, but we passed one checkpoint that had been overrun by our forces so recently that the spattered blood on the gravel was still cherry red. All of the enemy had been stripped of anything useful, some in their underwear, their boots gone, not so much as a glove left on them. The air stank of rancid burned hair, sickly sweet flesh, and rank boiled blood, more than one body trapped in the flaming LSAR trucks that lined the narrow roadways. It made my guts roll, but I focused on getting my troops through the logjam, and soon we came upon live men wearing the green field jackets of the New Wilderness Coalition. They waved us through the rear guard checkpoints, and we drove into the improvised main camp of our field army. Here the circle of barbed wire was small, the lookouts wary, the tents hastily erected. Our strategy relied on never staying in one place too long, since the further north we went, the closer we got to LSAR's air assets, radio direction finding devices, and drones. As such, the camp was far less permanent than New Wilderness or Ark River, but still it buzzed with activity. Messengers on the backs of horses, bone-faced whitetail, or even a few motorcycles came and went carrying orders to units that weren't vital enough to risk putting on the radio, thus reducing our odds of being detected by LSAR. Medics carried wounded on stretchers, not many, but enough that it made my heart twinge in sympathy at the bloody, broken figures of my fellow rangers. Ammunition carriers moved with the messengers to bring more supplies to the front, and a generator powered a nearby radio antenna to extend our signal range to the entire front line. Parking our vehicles in a small motor pool where several others were, I gave my platoon 15 minutes to rest, while I grabbed the canvas bag with the launch panel and headed for Sean's tent. The moment I stepped inside, he greeted me with a relieved nod and locked the missile control module in a small metal cabinet bolted inside his command vehicle. Well done, Brun. That went smoother than I thought. Any trouble at the site? If there will be trouble, I have a feeling it won't be during daylight hours. I shook my head and dug my thumbnail into the leather strap of my Type 9 to distract my nervous thoughts. I don't think anyone knows it's there. Good. Sean rested his hands on both hips and surveyed the battle map in front of him. We're making great progress. Most LSAR forces in the Central Valley have been pushed out, and casualties have been pretty light. At this point we're looking at setting up camp near the first phase line of our offensive. Trying not to make it obvious that I was eyeing everyone in the tent, searching for Chris, I shuffled on my muddy boot heels. So, where do you want us? He pointed to a hilltop on the map, radio operators and message couriers swirling around us in their tasks like fish in a coral reef. We've got a forward aid station set up here, about 5 miles north. They radioed in a half hour ago saying they needed more supplies. You and your platoon can run that up to them, and from there you'll range north to scout the forward enemy positions. So much for finding Chris today. Saluting, I drew a deep breath of disappointment. Will do, sir. In another 15 minutes we rolled back out the gates of the primitive base, and into the chaos of our front line. Moving north, I saw more evidence of the fighting, more destroyed vehicles bathed in wreaths of red flame, more sprawling bodies crumpled where they'd been cut down by gunfire, and muddy shell craters where enemy positions had been demolished by our artillery. However, the roar of the howitzers only grew louder, the chatter of machine guns more pronounced, and twice we passed ambulance trucks marked with red crosses as they ferried wounded from the aid stations. Here a few of the wrecks were our own, 2 unarmored trucks melted to scrap metal, and one of the special up-armored pickups nearly blown in half by a rocket. Our tires gritted over spent casings that dotted the roadway in a glittering golden sheen, and I tasted the acrid gunpowder residue hanging in the air like a thin fog. At last, a small pine-ridden knoll with an improvised tractor path leading to its crest came into view, and I held my breath as we slowly inched up the precarious trail to the summit. Barbed wire and foxholes with machine gun nests circled its perimeter, manned by the younger members of our coalition who weren't meant for frontline work. Inside, a row of tents housed scurrying crews of researcher medics, many with rusty red smears on their white aprons, and I recognized quite a few girls who had once wrinkled their nose at mud on the clinic floor in New Wilderness. It was the screams, however, that sent shudders of dread through my spine the instant I opened my truck door. Agonized cries of wounded, the metallic scent of blood on the air, and the hollow eyes of the passing nurses spoke volumes. A small cluster of blanket-covered bodies lay motionless outside one tent, close to 10 sets of boots poking from underneath them in a lifeless slump. Everywhere the place oozed with human misery, including a small wire pen containing several gray-clad prisoners, most of them a mass of white cotton bandages that were already soaked through with blood. One solitary boy, perhaps no older than 12 or 13, stood guard over the miniature POW cage with an aged shotgun, but I could tell from his indifferent slouch that he knew as well as I did that those men were going nowhere. Our own troops were prioritized by the medical staff, and as if to accentuate the need, they carried one man inside with 3 tourniquets on the shredded remnants of what had once been a leg. Mere seconds later, I caught the cruel slush of a saw working through flesh that made a wave of nausea rise in my stomach. He was one of ours, but obviously whatever painkillers we had were in short supply, as the poor fellow shrieked until I assumed he passed out, the saw continuing its grim work regardless of his silence. Doubtless the girls of the researcher faction had done only what was necessary to preserve the man's life, but still, the noise set my teeth on edge. Yeah, I'm not sleeping tonight. All right, squad leaders, take charge and get the aid unloaded. I barked at the others, and swallowed a sour-tasting gulp of air that made me gag for the stench on it. We're Oscar Mike in 30 minutes. Desperate to report to the head nurse so I could be rid of this place as fast as possible. I pushed through the swirl of busy people, until one of the nearby machine gunners called out to me from their dugout. "Lieutenant." My legs ground to a halt, and I returned a weary salute to the 3 thin-faced teenagers in the foxhole, trying to look as stoic as possible. "Morning, boys. You all good here? Need anything?" For a moment, they eyed each other in pale trepidation and glanced out beyond their belt-fed weapon into the forest not 15 yards distant. "We're all set, ma'am," the gunner replied, though his nervous eyes said otherwise. "It's just we wanted you to see this." He pointed down the hill to where a birch tree stood amongst the tangle of oaks, maples, and the few pines that clustered the top of the hill. At first, I was confused at what he meant, but then my eyes sharpened, the enhanced irises focused with ease, and I picked it out before he even said a word. Drawn on the trunk of the birch stood a black figure, long and spindly, with a head like an upside-down triangle, a twig-like crown, and 2 arms extended outward. Kneeling worshippers were dogged around its feet, and wavy lines radiated from the tall figure's hands. It had been painted in some kind of dark mixture, likely mud and rot, though I had a feeling there were more vile ingredients to it. Handprints dotted the tree around the bizarre hieroglyph, all human in shape, of varying sizes, nearly covering the trunk so that it looked mottled. "Lieutenant." I blinked and looked down to find them watching me with unease. "Should we call headquarters?" Hefting his rifle, the gunner threw a suspicious frown toward the woods. "I mean, we've got plenty of ammo, but if there's something out there it'd sure be nice to know." Holding my breath, I remembered Sean's words about the need to stay on task. But he did say to keep an eye out, didn't he? Then again, what good does this do me? We still don't know where Vesitorik is, only that his forces are close, as always. Puppets make those markings all the time. Doing my best to appear calm, I shrugged my submachine gun strap higher on one shoulder. "It's like a dog peeing on a fence. Probably an old one anyway, so nothing to worry about." Unconvinced, the gunner's mate, a scrawny red-haired kid, raises one bushy eyebrow. "It wasn't there when we started digging in 3 hours ago." Unnerved, I stared at him and fought a shiver. That close? They'd come that close? The trees had obviously shaded them from the sun's rays, but still, it wasn't good. Just like the auto stalker stampede. Vesatorik is on the cusp of being able to move in broad daylight, and he knows it. They're following our convoys, all the way north, waiting for the precise moment to strike. Still, I couldn't panic, not now, and certainly not in front of these men. I was an officer, and that meant I had to lead by example like Chris did. Good officers didn't show fear. Good officers found solutions when they ran into problems, good officers took care of their soldiers no matter what, and above all, good officers didn't run from trouble when it came knocking. Even if my orders prevented me from staying, I had to do something, give some assurance to these troopers who were of the same stripe as me. With a straightened back, I mustered up every ounce of courage I had and gave them a stern nod. I'll let command know. Until then, make sure there's always 2 people awake on night watch, and I'll keep one ear to my radio. If anything happens, you call for me, and we'll drive right through to back you up, okay? That brought a few relieved smiles to their painted faces, and the oldest boy made an appreciative salute as I turned to leave. Thank you, ma'am. Sloshing through the mud back to my own platoon sent a spike of shame through my chest, as something deep down inside begged me to stay. In spite of how awful the aid station was, with its nightmarish cries, the heartbreaking groans of the wounded and dying, I didn't want to leave the young garrison alone. Vesatorik was out there somewhere, circling like a wolf with his cursed puppet army, though why they hadn't attacked yet, I couldn't say. The aid station had enough firepower to keep him at bay, in theory at least, but I remembered how quickly our forces deteriorated the first time we'd run into the Mold King's children. However, the war waited for no one, and while I hated to go against my gut, I knew Sean was right. The sooner we reached the safety of Black Oak's walls, the better. Maybe we'll get lucky, and the rotted creep will step on a landmine or something. Surely that would do him in? Or perhaps a nice fat smart bomb, courtesy of Elsar. Brooding on my misgivings, I climbed back into my truck, and Lucille pressed her face to the small window between the cab and armored compartment with a glowing smile. Did you hear? The nurses said our forward units captured one of those fancy armored trucks Elsar drives. It even has heated seats. They said it might all be over before Christmas. My spine tingled, the scars under my tattoos itched, and I glared at the nearby tree line with a sick feeling in my guts. We'll see. Perched atop my command truck, I stared off into the misty blackness, a thick wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the Type 9 cradled in my arms. Dawn was close, but even in the dark the fighting had barely petered off, enemy patrols doing their best to track our distraction sorties in the dark. Curtains of thick white fog hugged the surrounding hills like tufts of cotton, and occasionally lit up from artillery on the horizon. Most of us had bedded down in pre-arranged hide spots many hours ago, digging in and waiting for the sunrise. With the sheer amount of mutants out there, Vesatorik notwithstanding, it was safer to stay inside the wire. Not that it's much safer in the daylight with all the shells flying back and forth. Palming the modified radio, I clicked the talk button again and checked my watch. Last call, Sparrow 1 actual to Falcon, come in Falcon. If you can read me, please respond. Use your Morse key if your signal is weak. Static hissed in the speaker, and I sighed in disappointment. We would be on the move soon, so I felt confident enough to risk a radio transmission before we set off. With how far north we were, I'd figured reaching Jamie would be impossible, but still I wanted to hope. You there, Sparrow? My heart leapt, and I almost dropped the radio in excitement, my face split with a smile. I'm here. I'm here, I can hear you. Your signal is really great, are you somewhere safe? Static crackled, and Jamie's voice came through in a weary chuckle. Sort of. Good to hear your voice, Brandy Badass. How's the game going? Even though we hadn't had much time before her banishment to set up a formal code system for speaking over the radio, I knew Jamie well enough to recognize what she was talking about. Seems good so far. I shrugged, remembered she couldn't see me, and stared at the radio speaker, missing my old phone. I haven't been in the thick of it, mostly. Just running errands. Mr. Wonderful got you on the sidelines. Her teasing brought a rare grin to my face, and it felt good to laugh. Nah, it was big man's call. Though if I'm being honest, Mr. Wonderful probably doesn't mind me being away from the rough stuff. Of course, once we get to where we're going, I doubt anyone will be able to stay out of it for long. Yeah. Jamie paused for a moment, as if unsure what to say next. Come on, Hannah, you're already talking about yourself while she's the one who's sleeping in the woods alone. Mortified at my own selfishness, I clicked the talk button again. So, how are you holding up? I've been worried sick about you. Are you getting enough to eat? Still on the move? She sighed. Food's been light, but I've managed to snag some fish and small game here and there. I definitely won't have to worry about fitting into my bikini next year. The rueful sarcasm in her voice made my chest hurt, and I winced despite myself. I miss you, you know. I think about turning around to go pick you up all the time. I'm sure Mr. Wonderful would come with me if I did. She laughed at that, though it ended in something that sounded like a sniffle. I miss you too, you amazing little dork. Remember how we used to go jogging around the fort in the mornings? Used to take extra long lacing up our shoes so the guys would already be shirtless and running by the time we started. I tried not to tear up at the melancholy that overtook me at the warm memories, and it felt like I was speaking to Jamie's ghost, as if she were already dead. It certainly made the run a little nicer. Remember how the kebab stand would sell those barbecue specials on Saturdays? I could have eaten those things all. Clear the air, all units stand by for orders. Sean's voice thundered over the headset I had looped around my neck, the volume turned up so I could hear without the speakers pressed to my ears. His strained tone made my blood run cold, and it took me a moment to realize I still had the talk button pushed down on my special radio. All Rhino, Stag, and Sparrow units, I say again, all combat units, converge on Rally Point 13. Rhino 1 Actual will take command on the ground and direct the teams from there. This is an immediate priority, break camp and move to target as fast as possible. Hilltop out. My throat felt dry, and I sucked in a tense breath. Rhino 1 Actual, that's Chris. Sean's sending in everyone, us included. This is it. I gotta go. Both legs screamed with pins and needles as I struggled to my feet. I heard Jamie rasp from the other side of the radio. Must be a big one. Be careful out there, okay? You too. I grimaced, wishing I could hug her through the speaker. Talk to you again soon. Stay safe, Falcon. Our small patrol base came to life in moments as the other officers exploded from their tents to wake their respective troops. Tents spotted the ground, some built onto the side of our vehicles, but they swarmed with motion as we leaders ran to wake our groggy soldiers. In total, our forces stood at 183 fighters from New Wilderness, and roughly 720 from Ark River, the remainder of our 1,000-strong populace either too old, young, or medically unfit to fight. Each mobile fort was made to house 2 or 3 platoons of roughly 25 men each, thus making our forces harder to spot, track, and shell from the air. Not all were front-line fighters, of course. There were medics, logistics crews, messengers, and the odd headquarters radio operator, but all carried weapons, and when push came to shove, everyone was a rifleman. Let's go, everyone up. Heart pumping like mad, I ran down the line of tents holding my men and rapped on the tent poles with the buttstock of my Type 9. We're going in, get up. NCOs, get your guys in order, we've gotta move. Engines revved, tents were ripped down in record time, and the fighters dressed as they ran, faces pale with anticipation. Headlights flared to life to bathe the area in white cones of light, the tangy scent of diesel exhaust filled the air, and the various pack animals in camp snorted with pent-up energy. As fast as they could, my crew formed ranks, and I counted off tousled heads until I got my total. 25. Will there be 25 come tomorrow? Will there be any? Okay, you've got 5 minutes. I shouted over the roar of the engines and ran to help Lucille finish collecting my own tent and gear. Get your gear squared away, hit the latrine one last time, and mount up. Squad leaders, let me know when your trucks are ready to roll. Barely visible between the fog, long streaks of crimson, orange, and pink nibbled at the sky as we rolled out of the makeshift gates, the support platoon of workers behind us laboring feverishly to tear down the fences and packing the coiled wire away for the next time. Cool air rushed into our rolled down windows, the worn tires kicked up showers of gray mud, and I found myself at the head of our small convoy as we raced through the dilapidated countryside towards our rally point. Like golden ants emerging from a nest, more headlights soon appeared from roads all over and flooded into a wide rolling field about 5 miles northwest of our campsite. Men with reflective flags waves to us from the ramparts of another temporary base squarely in the middle, itself in the final stages of teardown. Here the old wheat had long since been scorched by wildfires, and the grass had grown up to create a wide swathe of emerald green. Column after column circled the tiny camp, and as we all rolled in, I copied the other commanders to leap from my command truck and raced for the flags in a breathless sprint. A familiar broad set of shoulders came into view, and my frantic heart skipped an overjoyed beat. Hello, Mr. Wonderful. Poised in the midst of the stampede of faces, Chris stood on the hood of his armored pickup, and scanned the field with his eyes as we all came in. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his blue eyes, his uniform dirty and even speckled with dried blood in places, but he was still in one piece. Our eyes met across the crowd, and I saw him fight back a smile of relief. Okay, listen up. He shouted over the crowd as lieutenants and platoon sergeants clustered in around his truck. We've just received word from a forward scout unit that they discovered an enemy field depot not far from here. According to their reports, we believe this is the main supply hub connecting all LSAR units not currently in Black Oak or stationed on the border. 2 of his men held up a map so we could see, and Chris traced a route with a stick as a pointer. Our objective is here, an abandoned road maintenance station which LSAR has converted into a forward operating base. Now this depot will have fuel, ammunition, meds, everything we need to keep our momentum up. I don't have to tell you what that could mean for us, if we capture it intact. Heads nodded, and a multitude of eyes flashed in eager, if nervous understanding. This was huge, our biggest effort yet in the past few days. I couldn't help but share the excitement in the moment, though my poor intestines writhed like snakes in dread at what was to come. I hated killing other people, had done it only a few times, but enough to know it was terrible. Now that the lives of others were in my charge, I felt ready to vomit at the prospect of taking them into the hellish inferno of human warfare. But if I don't, they'll die anyway. LSAR, Vesatoruk, starvation, it makes no difference. Either we fight now or die later. Straightening up, Chris surveyed us with a stern line across his lips. We are less than 15 miles south of Black Oak, but with this heavy fog, they'll have a hard time bringing any air support to bear. If we can pull this off, LSAR's men will be forced to withdraw into the city for lack of supplies, giving us cover to reach the gates. By taking this depot, we could have a chance to end the war in a matter of days. Pencil in hand, I hurried to copy the map as best I could in my own notebook and waited alongside the others with bated breath. However, the enemy is not completely unprepared. Chris turned back to the map, and pointed out each objective by name. They've got 3 machine gun bunkers on the north, east, and western sides in a triangular formation to cover all approaches. They likely have mortar and rocket positions on the warehouse rooftops, along with snipers. From the activity inside, We're looking at a garrison of around 120 men, most of which are bedded down in a two-story office building near the eastern bunker. It's going to be a tough nut to crack, but if we close the distance fast enough, we can overwhelm them with superior numbers. He swiveled to angle his pointer stick at each group of lieutenants as he went. In the first phase, I want all the howitzers and mortars brought in line of sight range, to focus on the concrete bunkers. Those have to be destroyed before we can move in, but we cannot shell the areas with fuel or ammo, otherwise the entire place will go up. Snipers and battle truck gunners, I need you to circle the enemy on 3 sides and engage the rooftops to keep them from bringing their artillery and rockets to bear. In the second phase, after the barrage has suppressed the defenses, our infantry will move in and clear the base from west to east in an L-shaped assault. Cavalry and scouts, you guys are to dismount and move in with the rest of our infantry on foot. We'll bound forward under covering fire from light machine guns in the rear. Any questions? Heads shook back and forth, and Chris put both hands on his hips in satisfaction. All right then. We go on my flare. The operation stops when I call ceasefire over the radio, or if I shoot another flare. Remember, we only have a limited window of time to get in, smoke the defenders, and call our logistics boys in to haul away the loot before the fog clears. That means we have to be thorough, we have to be fast, and above all else, we have to be vicious. Do not stop your attack for anything, otherwise, if we get bogged down, they'll drop a yatum on our heads. Understood? Yes, sir. The crowd rumbled, and I raised my arm in salute with the rest, a mix of emotions in my chest. I was proud, both of Chris and myself, that this moment had come to us. However, I knew Chris would be at the front as always, and so would I. The odds of either of us catching a bullet would be high, and even with all the captured supplies from Elsar, our medics couldn't save everyone. If I walk into an aid station and he's there getting his legs sawn off, oh God, I'll lose my mind. All right then, take 5 minutes to brief your platoons, and stand by to move out. Chris hopped down from his truck, and everyone flew into motion again. Standing there, I fought to make myself move, frozen in the moment. I knew I didn't have time to go see him, not when so much was happening, but my heart ached at the sight of Chris's exhausted face, my mind pleaded with me to run to him, and the raw human part of me craved his reassuring touch now more than ever. He'd always been there to guide me through the rough patches before, but I couldn't be there for him now. We'd been entrusted with positions of power, handed the reins of the future, and that meant sacrificing everything for the betterment of the war effort. Others have gone through worse to get me this far. It's time I repaid that favor. Reluctantly I turned back to my column and jogged to 4th Platoon. Once we briefed our troops, we drove northward for a mile or so and staged our vehicles behind a small clump of hills opposite our target. The air was cold, but we scaled the wet clay slope in single files lines, nervously scanning the trees and brush around us for any signs of mutants. We all knew this was an enormous risk, but none were as nervous as I was, my tattoos itching in recognition of our danger. True, this gamble could pay off in high reward, but if Vesitoric were to pounce on us now, we would lose more than a few of our number. At last, we crested the ridge and looked down on our target. Ringed with a chain link fence backed up by wire mesh cages filled with dirt called HESCO barriers, the depot was impressive in its size, and I could see 3 large sheet metal warehouses inside, along with round fuel storage tanks on one end, and a 2-story office building on the other. Sandbag positions on the nearly flat rooftops spoke to where the rockets and snipers were, and squat concrete boxes blocked the approaches on 3 sides, these undoubtedly the machine gun nests. Numerous military trucks, both armored fighting ones like ours and unarmored cargo ones, were arranged in rows inside the wire, pallets of boxes clustered in between. This place clearly had a lot of supplies packed into it, and judging from the few soldiers we could see walking in the open, they weren't expecting an attack this early. Huddled to the damp grass at the base of the hills we'd climbed over, I sucked in a breath and checked my wristwatch. The tiny black metal second hand ticked in sync with my heart, a familiar weight of dread heavy on my shoulders. It was still cold, the morning young, and the sun didn't yet have the strength to disperse the damp curtain of mist. Dew wetted the cloth of my uniform, and I fought shivers that came both from cold and fear. Any second now. Behind me, 4th Platoon lay concealed in the grass, their painted faces hidden by the shadow of their steel helmets, each waiting for me to give the word. Hunched in the tall weeds of the unkempt Appalachian countryside, our world had been narrowed to the immediate area within line of sight, and like rabbits we were hesitant to poke our heads up from the relative safety of our hiding spot. Boom, 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 boom. With a thunderous roar, the quiet was shattered, and bone-chilling whistles hurtled through the air overhead to impact in the trees not far off. Kaboom! Dirt flew into the air, tree trunks splintered, and bits of debris rained down in a hail of broken earth. Despite our artillery being over 100 yards to our rear, I felt each detonation in my chest as if the shells had exploded right next to me. Mortars screamed in at high, shrieking arcs, while the howitzers lay entire groves to waste, felling great oaks, pines, and maples in a single shot. Fire caught in various places, stones the size of car tires were thrown into the sky, and I hugged the ground along with the rest of my command in sheer terror at our bombardment. Nobody could survive that. However, the tiny voice of experience within myself knew better than to create false hope, and as I held my fingers to my ears, I squinted between blades of grass at the hazy outlines of entrenchments across the old county road. Elsar didn't hire fools for their security forces, their field troops well trained and battle hardened. I had no idea if God existed, but once again, I found myself praying, hoping that someone, anyone, could take time out of their celestial existence to watch over us pitiful few. Pop hiss. Into darkened sky, a red flare shot like a comet, leaving a long, bloody trail in its wake. My gut clenched, I pulled the fingers from my ears as the guns fell silent and heard the cries of the other platoons to our left flank, along with the shrill tin whistles each officer had been issued. Machine guns roared to life with heavy bam-bam-bams, and crimson tracers cut through the night from our surplus militia ammunition. The other platoons lunged into motion, a tidal wave of drab-uniformed figures screaming like banshees until their throats were sore. Bright green tracers began to slice through the air toward us from the garrison, the bullets snapping around my ears like angry bees. The fog swirled from the detonations of hand grenades thrown in waves by our advancing men, dirt seemed to rain from the sky in a constant hail, and the shadows were broken by the bursting of explosions in yellow sparks. Old man in heaven, if you're up there, please don't leave us now. Putting my own metal whistle to my lips, I blew a long, hard blast, and leapt upright, submachine gun in hand. 4th Platoon, on your feet.